The drive home felt longer than usual even though it was only 12 miles from Daniel's neighborhood to my small brick house on Maple Street. The radio stayed off. I prefer silence when my thoughts need room. Streetlights passed over the windshield in steady intervals, casting brief bands of light across the dashboard, then disappearing behind me. I parked in my driveway, cut the engine, and sat there for a moment with both hands resting in my lap. The house looked the same as it had that morning, porch light glowing softly, curtains drawn just enough to keep the living room private. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air carried the faint scent of lavender from the sachets I keep in the hallway closet. My heels clicked once against the tile before I slipped them off and placed them neatly by the wall. Everything was exactly where I had left it. The armchair by the window. The framed photograph of Daniel at his college graduation. The clock above the mantel ticking in its patient rhythm. I walked into the kitchen and filled the kettle with water. The simple act grounded me. I placed it on the stove and waited for the low hum to begin. When you live alone long enough, you learn to measure time by small sounds. The kettle beginning to sing. The refrigerator cycling on. The hum of the furnace. I poured hot water over a chamomile tea bag and carried the mug into the living room, lowering myself into the armchair with deliberate care. My knees ache more than they used to, but they still hold me upright. I looked at Daniel's photograph for a long time. He was smiling in that picture, 22 years old, hopeful, standing under a bright May sky in a rented cap and gown. I remember that day clearly. The heat was nearly 85 degrees. I had sat in metal bleachers for 2 hours, fanning myself with the program, refusing to complain because he kept searching the crowd to make sure I was there. I was always there. Parent-teacher conferences, little league games, late-night science projects spread across the dining table. I stitched costumes for school plays. I packed lunches with handwritten notes tucked inside. I knew the names of his teachers, his friends, the girl who broke his heart in 11th grade. I knew when he pretended not to cry. I also knew when he did. I sipped my tea and let the warmth settle in my chest. Just a housewife. It is interesting how easily that phrase erases decades of invisible labor. There were years when I woke at 5 in the morning to iron Daniel's shirts before school, and then drove across town to take bookkeeping shifts for a local clinic, cash under the table, because we needed the extra income after my husband passed. I never called it a career. It was simply what had to be done. I balanced checkbooks late at night while Daniel slept, the kitchen light the only one still glowing in the house. I learned how to fix a leaking faucet from a library book, because hiring a plumber was out of the question. I filed insurance claims, negotiated bills, and made sure there was always enough for tuition when the time came. No one applauds those things. They are not listed on resumes. They are not announced at corporate dinners. They are folded quietly into the fabric of a family's success until the fabric is taken for granted. I set the empty mug on the side table and leaned back into the chair. The room felt calm, steady, almost protective. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then stopped. I closed my eyes and replayed Daniel's voice in my mind, not to punish myself but to study it. There had been impatience there. A hint of embarrassment. As if my presence disrupted the image he wanted to project. I wondered when that shift had begun. Perhaps it was gradual. Perhaps I missed the early signs because I was too busy being proud of him. Pride can blur things. It makes you overlook the small dismissals, the slight changes in tone, the way conversations become shorter. I opened my eyes and looked around my living room again. This house is modest. 1,200 square feet. 2 bedrooms. 1 bathroom with tiles I installed myself 15 years ago. It is not impressive. It is not grand. But it is mine. Every bill paid. Every mortgage installment completed. No one can ask me to step out of it for being inconvenient. I stood and walked toward the hallway, brushing my fingers lightly along the wall as I passed. There is strength in quiet continuity. I have lived long enough to understand that respect is not always given in proportion to sacrifice. Sometimes it must be revealed in other ways. Daniel believes he understands pressure. He believes he understands responsibility. He does not yet understand the full story of the woman who raised him. And tonight, for the first time in a very long while, I began to consider whether it might be time for him to learn. The next morning I woke before the alarm. the way I always do when something unsettled has not yet finished speaking inside me. The sky outside my bedroom window was still a pale gray, the sun only beginning to press faint light against the horizon. I lay there for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the house, and then I sat up, smoothed the blanket, and made my bed with practiced precision. There is comfort in order. I dressed carefully, choosing a cream blouse and a tailored navy skirt, the kind I used to wear years ago when presentation mattered more than explanation. I brushed my hair until it fell neatly into place and applied a light touch of lipstick. Nothing dramatic, just deliberate. In the kitchen I prepared oatmeal with sliced apples and a drizzle of honey, the same breakfast I have eaten for years. I set the bowl at the small table by the window and looked out at Maple Street as neighbors began their routines. A man in running shoes passed by with steady strides. A school bus paused at the corner. Life continuing as it always does, indifferent to private revelations. After breakfast I walked down the hallway to the spare bedroom that now serves as my study. The door creaked slightly when I pushed it open. Inside, sunlight touched the top of a wooden filing cabinet that has followed me through 3 different addresses. I knelt slowly and pulled open the bottom drawer. The folders inside were organized by year, each labeled in my careful handwriting. Tax returns, mortgage statements, investment accounts, certificates. I lifted a thick envelope marked 29 years ago and placed it on the desk. For a moment I simply rested my hand on it. The paper felt cool beneath my palm. I had not looked at these documents in a long time. Not because they were unimportant but because they had never been necessary to display. Some accomplishments are not trophies. They are foundations. I opened the envelope and slid out the first document. A framed certificate from the state board, confirming licensure that I had once earned after years of study and clinical rotations that left my feet aching and my eyes burning. I remember the weight of those textbooks, each one nearly 5 pounds, stacked high on my desk in a tiny apartment while Daniel slept in a crib beside me. I remember reviewing patient charts under fluorescent lights long after midnight, determined not to waste the opportunity one had fought for. I did not abandon that path because I lacked ability. I stepped away because Daniel needed stability more than I needed recognition. That was not a failure. That was a choice. I continued sorting through the folder, laying papers neatly across the desk. Letters of commendation, continuing education records, old hospital identification badges with my photograph clipped awkwardly against a white lab coat. My younger face looked back at me from laminated plastic, eyes sharp, posture straight. For years after I left that world, former colleagues sent holiday cards addressed with the title Daniel has never once heard spoken aloud in our home. I never corrected him when he introduced me simply as his mother. I believed that role was enough. I sat back in the chair and folded my hands in my lap. The room felt smaller now, filled with evidence of a life that had been carefully stored away. Daniel believes that pressure is defined by quarterly reports and client meetings. He does not remember the pressure of holding someone's future in your hands, of calculating dosages with precision, because there is no margin for error. He does not remember the nights I came home exhausted and still knelt beside his bed to check his temperature when he had the flu. Perhaps he does not remember because I made it look effortless. That is the quiet paradox of sacrifice. If done well, it disappears. I gathered the documents and returned them to the envelope, but this time I did not place it back in the bottom drawer. Instead, I set it neatly on the desk surface where it could be seen. I rose from the chair and walked back into the hallway, pausing at the mirror to study my reflection once more. I did not feel anger. I felt something clearer than that. Daniel did not ask who I had been before I was his mother. He assumed the answer. And assumptions, I have learned, are fragile things. I picked up my phone from the kitchen counter and scrolled calmly through my contacts until I found a name I had not dialed in years. My finger hovered over it for only a second before I pressed call. The line began to ring, steady and unhurried, as I stood there in my quiet house, prepared at last to let the past step gently into the present. The ringing on the other end of the line lasted only 3 beats before a familiar voice answered. Deeper now, seasoned by time yet still unmistakably steady. Harrison Cole had once been a young resident who shadowed me through 12-hour shifts, asking careful questions and scribbling notes with restless determination. Now his tone carried authority. "Margaret," he said, And even through the phone I could hear the pause of recognition settling in. It has been a long time. I smiled slightly, not because I was surprised he remembered me, but because I had known he would. It has, I replied. I hope I am not calling at an inconvenient hour. He assured me that I was not. His voice softened with warmth that did not feel rehearsed. He told me he still keeps the letter I once wrote recommending him for his first attending position. He said he had often wondered how I was doing after I left the hospital so suddenly all those years ago. I listened without interrupting. It is an unusual experience to hear your own past described by someone who respected it. When he finished, I explained in measured detail that I had chosen to step away from medicine to focus on raising my son after my husband's death. I did not dramatize it. I simply stated it as fact. There was a long silence on the line, the kind that carries understanding rather than confusion. You were one of the finest physicians I ever trained under, he said quietly. We all knew that. I thanked him but did not allow the compliment to linger. I asked about his current role, and he explained that he now serves as Chief of Internal Medicine at St. Catherine's Medical Center. His responsibilities are vast, his schedule demanding, yet his tone remained grounded. Before we ended the call, he added something that made me pause. We are hosting a fundraising gala next Friday evening. It would mean a great deal if you attended. Many of the younger doctors have heard your name in passing, but they have never met you. I would like them to. I stood by the kitchen window while he spoke, sunlight now fully illuminating Maple Street. A charity event. Formal attire. Community leaders. It had been years since I stepped into that world. For a moment I considered declining out of habit. Then I thought of Daniel's dining table, his dismissive shrug, the ease with which he reduced decades to a single phrase. I will come, I said calmly. After we hung up, I remained standing in the kitchen, phone resting lightly in my hand. The house felt different, not louder or brighter but aware. I walked back into my study and opened the closet where an old garment bag hung untouched. Inside was a charcoal gray evening dress I had purchased nearly 15 years ago for a medical conference in Chicago. The fabric was still smooth, the lines still elegant. I ran my fingers along the sleeve and remembered standing at a podium under soft hotel ballroom lighting, presenting research to a room full of peers who listened with intent respect. No one in that room had seen me as small. I closed the garment bag gently and returned it to its place. My reflection in the mirror showed a woman who had carried two identities with equal care. One visible, one stored away. Neither insignificant. That afternoon I drove to the tailor downtown to ensure the dress still fit properly. The shop smelled faintly of starch and pressed cotton. The seamstress greeted me with professional politeness and measured the hem with steady hands. When she asked about the occasion, I answered simply, a reunion of sorts. On the way home, I stopped at the florist and ordered a modest corsage, nothing extravagant, just white gardenias. Their scent has always reminded me of resilience. By early evening, Daniel sent a brief message to my phone. It read, "Hope you got home safe." I stared at the screen for several seconds before setting it down without replying. Safety had never been my concern. Understanding had been. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, the envelope of documents still visible in the study down the hall. I did not intend to confront Daniel with anger or accusation. That has never been my way. But I also no longer intended to allow my history to remain silent simply because it was convenient for someone else. Next Friday evening would not be about revenge. It would be about presence. And sometimes presence is more powerful than any argument ever spoken aloud. Friday arrived with a quiet steadiness that felt almost ceremonial. I woke before sunrise again. But this time there was no heaviness pressing against my ribs. I showered, dressed in a silk robe, and stood in the hallway for a moment looking at the closed garment bag hanging from the closet door. The house was silent except for the soft ticking of the clock in the living room. I brewed coffee and carried the mug to the window, watching early morning light stretch across Maple Street. A few leaves drifted along the curb. The air outside looked crisp and clean. I did not feel nervous. I felt prepared. By late afternoon I laid the charcoal gray dress across my bed and smoothed the fabric with careful hands. The seamstress had adjusted the hem perfectly. I dressed slowly, fastening each button with deliberate attention. The material fit comfortably against my shoulders, neither tight nor loose, simply correct. I pinned the white gardenias near my collarbone, and their scent rose gently around me, subtle but unmistakable. I applied a touch of foundation, brushed my hair into a low twist, and selected a pair of pearl earrings that had once belonged to my mother. When I looked into the mirror, I did not see a woman trying to prove anything. I saw continuity. I saw the same steadiness that carried me through long hospital shifts and parent-teacher meetings and sleepless nights. At 6:30 sharp, a black sedan sent by the hospital pulled into my driveway. I stepped outside, locking the door behind me, and the driver greeted me with courteous professionalism. As we drove toward downtown, city lights began to flicker on against the darkening sky. St. Catherine's Medical Center stood illuminated at the top of the hill, its glass facade reflecting the evening glow. The gala was held in the adjoining conference center, where large windows revealed chandeliers, casting warm light over round tables dressed in white linen. The driver opened my door and I stepped onto the pavement with measured grace. Inside, the hum of conversation floated through the foyer. Men in tailored suits and women in elegant gowns moved through the room with practiced ease. I paused only briefly before entering fully, feeling the subtle shift in posture that comes when someone re-enters a familiar world. Harrison spotted me from across the hall almost immediately. His expression transformed from polite attentiveness to unmistakable recognition. He crossed the room quickly, extending both hands. "Margaret," he said warmly, his voice carrying respect rather than surprise. "You look exactly as I remember." I smiled. "Time has been kind," I replied. He introduced me to several colleagues, each one nodding with genuine interest as he explained that I had once led one of the most efficient internal medicine teams in the state. I did not embellish his words or interrupt them. I simply stood with quiet composure while younger physicians listened carefully, some of them clearly intrigued. A few asked thoughtful questions about cases from decades past. I answered calmly, choosing details that reflected not technical brilliance but steady judgment and compassion. The room felt alive in a way that was both familiar and distant, like revisiting a city where you once lived. At one point, as I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, I noticed someone standing near the entrance with a puzzled expression. Daniel had arrived unexpectedly, his suit sharp, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. For a brief second he did not move. He looked from me to Harrison, then to the cluster of doctors surrounding us, each listening as Harrison described how I had mentored him through his residency. I saw confusion cross Daniel's face, followed by something else I could not immediately name. He approached slowly, adjusting his tie as though trying to regain control of the moment. Harrison turned and smiled. "Daniel, I did not realize you were connected to Margaret," he said with genuine delight. "You are fortunate. She trained some of the finest physicians in this hospital." Daniel's gaze shifted to me, searching for confirmation. I held his eyes calmly. There was no accusation there, only clarity. The music continued softly in the background. Glasses clinked. Conversations carried on. But for Daniel I could see that the room had grown very quiet, and for the first time in many years he was not speaking. Daniel stopped a few feet away from us, his posture still upright but no longer relaxed. The room continued its gentle rhythm of conversation and quiet laughter, yet around us there was a subtle shift, as if attention had narrowed without becoming obvious. Harrison placed a hand lightly on Daniel's shoulder, and spoke with the ease of someone unaware he was dismantling an illusion. "Your mother guided my entire approach to internal medicine," he said. "She insisted that precision and compassion must always stand side by side. I still repeat her words to residents today." Daniel's eyes flickered toward me again. There was no disbelief in them now, only confusion and something that resembled recalculation. I held my glass of sparkling water steadily, the gardenias at my collar releasing their soft scent with every breath I took. "You never told me," Daniel said quietly, though the music and murmured voices around us absorbed most of the sound. It was not an accusation. It was a realization. I met his gaze without lowering mine. "You never asked," I replied, my tone even and measured. Harrison looked between us, sensing that something personal had just unfolded, and excused himself politely to greet another guest. Daniel and I were left standing near a tall arrangement of white lilies, the chandeliers above reflecting faintly in his eyes. For a moment he seemed younger, as though the confidence he wore so easily had slipped just slightly. "Why would you stop?" he asked after a pause. I considered the question carefully before answering. "Because your father died unexpectedly," I said. "Because you were 12 years old. Because stability mattered more than titles." I did not speak quickly. I did not embellish the memory. I simply placed it between us like a fact that had always existed. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I thought you just chose to stay home," he said. "I did," I answered. "But I chose it knowing exactly what I was stepping away from." Around us, servers moved gracefully between tables, offering small plates and refilling glasses. A group of younger physicians laughed nearby, unaware that a different kind of education was taking place beside them. Daniel looked at the room again, watching as two doctors approached me with respectful nods and brief words of appreciation before moving on. He seemed to be measuring the distance between the version of me he had carried in his mind and the one standing before him now. "I am sorry," he said at last, the words careful and unforced. I did not rush to accept them or dismiss them. I allowed them to settle. "Understanding takes time," I replied. "So does perspective." He gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledges both truth and humility. For years I had believed that protecting him from the weight of my sacrifices was an act of love. I see now that silence can sometimes distort reality. Not maliciously, just quietly. The evening continued with speeches about innovation, community outreach, and the future of patient care. Harrison eventually took the podium and, in the midst of thanking donors and colleagues, mentioned my name again. He spoke not with exaggeration but with clarity, describing how mentorship shapes medicine across generations. Applause followed, polite but genuine. I inclined my head slightly and remained seated. I did not feel elevated. I felt balanced. When the program concluded, Daniel walked beside me toward the exit. He did not try to guide me or step ahead. He simply matched my pace. Outside, the night air was cool against my skin. The black sedan waited at the curb, its headlights casting a soft glow across the pavement. Before the driver opened the door, Daniel turned to me once more. "I should have known," he said quietly. I looked at him, not with reproach but with calm recognition. "You know now," I answered. There was no triumph in my voice, only steadiness. As I settled into the car and the door closed gently behind me, I saw Daniel remain on the sidewalk for a moment, hands in his pockets, watching the vehicle pull away. The city lights blurred slightly through the window as we descended the hill. I leaned back against the seat and allowed myself a slow breath. Respect does not need to be demanded. It only needs to be revealed. And tonight, without raising my voice or recounting every sacrifice, I had simply stepped back into the fullness of who I have always been. The ride home felt quieter than the drive to the hospital, though the city around me had not changed. Streetlights stretched in long golden lines across the windshield, and the hum of the engine beneath me was steady, predictable. I rested my hands lightly in my lap and allowed the events of the evening to settle without replaying them too forcefully. There was no need. The truth had spoken for itself. When the car turned onto Maple Street, I saw the familiar outline of my house waiting in the darkness, porch light casting a warm circle onto the front steps. The driver stepped out to open my door, and I thanked him with a small nod before walking up the path alone. The night air carried a faint chill, the kind that signals the quiet shift from late summer into early autumn. Inside, the house greeted me with the same calm it always had. I removed the gardenias and placed them gently into a small glass bowl of water on the kitchen counter. Their scent lingered softly in the room. I changed out of the charcoal gray dress with careful hands and hung it back inside the garment bag, smoothing the fabric once more before closing the zipper. There was no urgency in my movements. No trembling. Only deliberation. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, the overhead light casting a gentle glow across the polished wood surface. My phone rested beside me. It remained silent for nearly 10 minutes before it finally vibrated. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Are you home?" he asked, his voice no longer sharp or impatient. It carried uncertainty now, as though he were stepping carefully onto unfamiliar ground. Yes, I replied. I arrived a few minutes ago. There was a pause. I could hear him exhale. I did not know, he said again, as if repeating it might fill the space between us. I truly did not know. I considered his words before responding. It was not a secret, I said calmly. It was simply not discussed. Another silence followed, heavier than the first. Why did you never tell me? He asked. I traced a small circle on the table with my fingertip. Because I did not want you to feel that I gave something up for you, I answered. I chose what I chose. That was never meant to become a burden. On the other end of the line, I could hear the faint sound of traffic passing near him. He was likely still outside the hospital or walking toward his own car. I thought, he began then stopped. I thought staying home was easy for you. I allowed myself the smallest breath of acknowledgement. Nothing meaningful is ever easy, I said. But it can be worthwhile. The conversation did not erupt into apologies or dramatic declarations. It unfolded slowly, cautiously, like a door opening inch by inch. He asked about the hospital. About Harrison. About the years he could not remember clearly. I answered simply, without resentment, offering details that filled gaps rather than creating new ones. I did not recount every sleepless night or every sacrifice. That would have turned the moment into a ledger. Instead, I allowed him to understand in increments. When the call ended, he said he would like to visit the next afternoon. I told him he was welcome. After I placed the phone down, I remained seated for a while longer, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the clock. The house did not feel different, yet something within it had shifted. Not in the walls or the air, but in the space between past and present. I rose and walked into the study, where the envelope of documents still rested on the desk. I did not open it this time. I simply stood before it, knowing it no longer needed to serve as proof. Outside, a car passed slowly along Maple Street, headlights briefly illuminating the window before fading away. I turned off the study lamp and closed the door softly behind me. Respect does not demand noise. It settles into a room quietly when truth has been acknowledged. And as I prepared for bed that night, smoothing the blanket and placing my slippers neatly beside the bed, I felt no triumph, only equilibrium. For years I had been both visible and unseen at the same time. Tonight the balance had returned. Not because I insisted upon it, but because I allowed it to stand on its own. Daniel arrived the next afternoon precisely at 2 o'clock, just as he said he would. I saw his car pull into the driveway from the living room window, and I remained seated for a moment before standing to open the door. The sky was clear, sunlight falling gently across Maple Street, the kind of quiet suburban afternoon that carries no sense of urgency. When I opened the door, he looked slightly uncertain, as though he were stepping into a place that felt familiar but newly unfamiliar at the same time. "Hi, Mom," he said softly. I stepped aside and allowed him in. "Come in," I replied. The house smelled faintly of fresh coffee and lemon polish. I had tidied the living room that morning, straightened the cushions, dusted the shelves, not because he was coming, but because that is what I do. Order creates space for clarity. He walked slowly through the room, his eyes lingering on framed photographs he has seen countless times before. There he was at 8 years old holding a small fishing rod at Lake Harmony. There he was at 16 in a borrowed tuxedo before his junior prom. He stopped in front of the graduation photo again, studying it more closely than he had in years. "You kept everything," he said quietly. "Of course," I answered. "Memories do not require storage fees." He gave a faint smile at that, then turned toward me. "Can we sit?" he asked. We moved to the kitchen table where I poured 2 cups of coffee. He wrapped both hands around his mug as if drawing steadiness from its warmth. For a few moments neither of us spoke. The ticking clock filled the silence. Finally he cleared his throat. "I went home last night and thought about what you said," he began. "About choosing. About stability." I listened without interrupting. "I always told people my father worked hard and you stayed home," he continued. I never questioned what that meant. I never considered what it cost. His voice did not carry guilt so much as realization. I folded my hands calmly on the table. "There is nothing wrong with staying home," I said. but it should never be mistaken for absence of ability. He nodded slowly. I see that now. He hesitated, then added, Olivia did not know either. I tilted my head slightly. That is understandable, I replied. She only knows the version of me you described. The words were not sharp. They were factual. He absorbed them quietly. I described you as simple, he admitted. As someone who did not really work. The admission hung between us. I reached for my cup and took a measured sip before answering. Simplicity is not the same as insignificance, I said. Sometimes it is discipline. He looked down at the table, tracing the grain of the wood with his finger. Why did you never tell me about the hospital? He asked again, as though the question still unsettled him. I considered my answer carefully. Because I did not want you to feel pressure to become something in response to me, I said. I wanted you to choose freely. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. I thought I understood pressure, he said. But I was wrong. The room felt calm, steady, not tense. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures. Only conversation. I stood and walked into the study, returning a moment later with the envelope from the desk. I placed it gently in front of him. These are the records of who I was professionally, I said. Not for validation. Only for context. He opened the envelope carefully, scanning the documents inside. His eyebrows lifted slightly as he read through the certificates and letters. You were offered a leadership position, he murmured. Yes, I replied. I declined. He closed the folder slowly and looked at me with an expression that carried both respect and regret. I am sorry for diminishing you, he said, this time without hesitation. I held his gaze. I am not diminished, I answered calmly. But I appreciate the correction. He gave a small, genuine smile. The kind he used to give me when he was certain I had solved a problem he did not yet understand. Outside, a light breeze stirred the leaves along the sidewalk. Inside, the house felt grounded, unchanged in its foundation yet subtly stronger in its air. Daniel stood after a while and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he paused and turned back. Would you consider coming to dinner next week? He asked carefully. As my guest of honor? I allowed a faint smile to touch my lips. I will consider it, I replied. And as he stepped back into the afternoon sunlight, I did not feel victorious. I felt steady. Because respect, once recognized, does not need to be announced. It simply remains. The week passed without tension but not without thought. Daniel sent a brief message on Tuesday confirming dinner for Saturday evening at 7 o'clock. This time the invitation felt different. Not formal or performative, but intentional. I did not rush to respond. I finished watering the small rose bushes along my front walk, wiped my hands on a garden cloth, and only then sent a simple reply that I would be there. Saturday arrived with the same steady rhythm that has defined most of my life. I spent the morning reading by the window, sunlight resting across the pages of a medical journal Harrison had mailed earlier in the week with a handwritten note thanking me again for attending the gala. I smiled at that. Gratitude travels in quiet circles. By late afternoon I selected a soft blue blouse and charcoal slacks, modest but precise. I pinned no corsage this time. There was no event to attend. Only dinner. When I arrived at Daniel's home, the porch light was already on though the sky had not yet darkened. He opened the door himself. His expression was not rehearsed. It was open. You look wonderful, he said, stepping aside. Olivia stood in the hallway behind him. For a brief moment our eyes met, and I saw uncertainty there, but also respect. Margaret, she said carefully, using my name rather than a title. We are glad you came. I nodded once. Thank you for inviting me. The dining table was set with care. Candles placed in the center, plates aligned precisely. It reminded me of the many dinners I had once prepared in kitchens that never carried my name on the deed. We sat together, and conversation began cautiously but naturally. Daniel asked about my week. Olivia inquired about the hospital gala, her tone sincere rather than curious. I answered evenly, describing the evening without embellishment. There was no need to prove anything. The food was simple, roasted chicken with vegetables, fresh bread, a salad with vinaigrette. Familiar. Comfortable. Halfway through the meal, Daniel placed his fork down and cleared his throat. I told a colleague about you, he said quietly. He looked you up. He found articles. He was impressed. I did not react outwardly. That is kind, I replied. The work was always a team effort. Olivia folded her hands on the table. I did not realize, she began, choosing her words with care, how much you accomplished. I apologize if I ever spoke carelessly. Her voice did not tremble. It carried humility. I studied her for a moment before responding. Awareness changes language, I said gently. That is enough. The candles flickered slightly as a soft draft moved through the room. Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching me not with confusion this time, but with a steadier gaze. I underestimated you, he said plainly. I allowed a faint smile to touch my lips. No, I corrected softly. You misunderstood me. The difference matters. Underestimation suggests weakness. Misunderstanding suggests absence of information. The rest of the evening unfolded without tension. We spoke of practical things, of community projects, of future plans. At one point Daniel laughed in the same unguarded way he had as a child, and I felt a quiet warmth rise in my chest. Not pride, not vindication, just continuity. When dinner ended, he walked me to the door again. The night air was cool, crisp against my skin. Thank you for coming, he said. Thank you for listening, I replied. As I drove home, Maple Street appearing once more beneath the glow of streetlights, I felt no need to revisit old words or old wounds. Respect had returned not because I demanded it, but because I allowed truth to stand without anger. When I entered my house and placed my keys on the small ceramic dish by the door, everything felt exactly as it had before this entire sequence began. The armchair by the window, the ticking clock, the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I walked into the study and closed the drawer where the documents were kept. They did not need to sit on the desk anymore. They had served their purpose without ever being waved like a flag. I turned off the light and stood for a moment in the doorway, reflecting not on what had been revealed, but on what had always been present. I was never defined by a single role. I was never reduced by a single sentence. I was a mother. I was a physician. I was a woman who chose deliberately. And now, without raising my voice or rewriting the past, I remained exactly who I had always been.